I want to welcome everybody to the webinar, which is titled Safer Chemical Assessment Tools and Do They Reliably Guide the Selection of Greener Alternatives? I don't want you to think that this is starting off with an answer in mind, so if you thought you were going to get an answer to this question today on the webinar, I hate to disappoint you, but we're not going to be answering that question. What we really want to do is to stimulate some thought around this question and look at it in light of all of the good work that has been going on so far in this area and talk about where we see opportunities for HESI going forward with this subcommittee. So I want to just go briefly over what the outline is going to be. We're going to give a brief introduction to the HESI organization for those who may not be familiar with it. And then I'm going to go into a brief overview of the HESI Sustainable Chemical Alternatives Technical Committee, what we've been doing, where we're at, and then where we want to go in the future. I want to put into context some other work that has been published recently and how that could potentially influence where we want to go. In particular, the most recent National Academy of Sciences report on a framework to guide selection of chemical alternatives, and then really talk about a more concrete plan for where we hope to take the technical committee in 2015. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Cyril Pettit, the HESI Executive Director, to give the overview on HESI, and then we'll come back to the content of the webinar. So Cyril?
Thank you, Pam. Okay, Nancy, do I have control here now?
Yes, you do.
Okay. So good morning, everyone. Thanks so much to all of you for joining us today. My name is Cyril Pettit, and I am the Executive Director of the Health and Environmental Sciences Institute. We know that some of you are very familiar with HESI as an organization, but for others of you who are joining us today, this may be a first introduction. So before I turn it back to Pam, I'd like to just borrow a few minutes and give you some context with regard to the organization. We are a nonprofit organization based in Washington, D.C., but we operate internationally with the mission of facilitating partnerships across academia, government, industry, foundations, and other research and clinical centers to seek to collaboratively identify and resolve human and environmental health issues. So that's a big mouthful, and sometimes it's a little hard to wrap around exactly what that means in practice. So I thought I would start with a graphic that I hope will better explain what it is that HESI does in the space in which we operate. So I think all of us, whoops. Sorry. Okay, I'm hoping this is going to stay here. Hopefully you all are seeing this slide with the circles here. All of us are here today because we are seeking to develop innovative solutions to environmental and human health challenges. And when you look at the constituency that's on the phone today and probably the groups that you all interact with in your day jobs, you know that that pathway between basic discovery research and that green circle on the far right of improved human and environmental health can sometimes be fairly convoluted, even though all of those groups may be intending to address a common human or environmental health challenges. But the connectivity between those groups, the pathways, the opportunities for interactions and feedback can often be a difficult road to travel, and often without any clear way to navigate those intersections across these different issues and groups. So it is really to that end that HESI was formulated with the question of how do we get to that green circle more efficiently? And remember that green circle was the goal of improving human and environmental health. And we think HESI is one effective platform for achieving just that. So the way that we do this is by serving as a professionally facilitated platform for interaction across academia. We have more than 100 universities, hospitals, NGOs, and research centers that work through HESI's programs. more than 33 different government agencies from around the globe, so those are both research and regulatory groups, more than 65 corporate sponsors, so in the industry sector, and those span multiple sectors from pharmaceutical, chemical, ag chem, consumer product, research centers, all of whom committed to working with HESI through a network of more than 500 different experts and about 16 different scientific committees within the HESI organization to collaboratively identify and seek to develop shared solutions, shared analysis that will help us to make progress towards commonly identified human or environmental health challenges. To give you a brief context for the areas in which HESI's work takes place, you can see here in this flower pot the 4 primary areas of focus where HESI's scientific committees and scientific work operates. Today we are primarily focused on that yellow box, the environmental quality and sustainability program. And that said, I think a number of you may have interest or experience with HESI in some of these other topical areas as well, and we think that it's important that they work in concert with each other because there are often many learnings and best practices to be shared across these different efforts. To give you just a couple of quick examples of what we really mean when we say that HESI facilitates collaboration and facilitates progress in human and environmental sciences, just a few examples here. Some of the kinds of things that we have done very successfully over the years are to help to develop, to identify, and to build consensus and weight of evidence around novel safety biomarkers or novel experimental assays that are now currently in use to the benefit of patients or to the benefit of environmental assessment with the broad buy-in of multiple sectors who had a role in helping to develop and characterize the information and its utility and interpretation. HESI has been very successful in developing decision frameworks, and I'm sure Pam will reference some of those concepts today. Several of the frameworks that we've developed, for example, for assessing the safety of agricultural chemicals have been now integrated into current practice, not just at local levels, but also in some cases at the global level in terms of best practices for conducting safety assessments. We are very committed as an organization to making the information that HESI generates, or at least the learnings that HESI generates, publicly accessible, because we think this is critical to ensuring access and uptake of information. We have had more than 4,000 citations of HESI's publications in its 25-year history by more than 1,300 authors worldwide. So those are 1,300 different authors that have been citing HESI's papers. So our reach is wide, both within countries and across different technical disciplines and sectors. And as I said, we have been in place for 25 years as an organization, so we are one of the longest standing multi-sector public-private partnerships that is in existence in the sciences. So we're very proud of what it is that we do, and we think that we do it quite effectively. For my final slide here, just to give you a sense of the portfolio of programs within HESI right now, all of this work happens in the context of specific scientific committees. The one that is circled on this slide here is the Sustainable Chemical Alternatives Program that Pam will be talking about. But I've highlighted in blue as well some other programs that we think could potentially be of interest to the constituency on the phone here today. And really just to emphasize for you that HESI seeks to both develop high-level frameworks for dealing with issues like sustainability, but is also critically involved in a number of the supporting elements of understanding aspects of toxicity, risk assessment, methodology that really roll into our ability to develop effective frameworks for broader scale and more challenging issues like the assessment of alternatives and their relative safety and efficacy. And one final note, just to put in one other element of HESI's work that we, in addition to doing the technical work, we are also increasingly involved as an educational organization and have been executing and developing programs to provide training on contemporary practices in risk assessment, safety evaluation globally, as we think that it's essential that we not only work with our partners in North America and Europe and perhaps Japan and China, but are really looking to expand globally and make sure that there is access to high-quality information and contemporary training and practices worldwide. So with that, I think I will turn the platform back to Pam. Again, thank all of you for joining us this morning, and I do hope that this will be the start of more interactions with those of you who are new to HESI, and we'll look forward to your questions and your feedback. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Cyril. We'll go ahead and see if I have control back of with the slides. And let's see. There we go. Good. All right. So hopefully what you're seeing is a slide that says today's challenging landscape, and I think you're probably all here because we can recognize that as we try to tackle the pressures to develop and find more sustainable alternatives, that this is really a challenge that we can't accomplish alone. This is a very widespread area. There's lots of regulatory drivers to replace chemicals of concern. I'm sure many are working with REACH authorization. We've got California Safer Consumer Products regulation that will soon be upon us, as well as initiatives with TSCA reform. Many companies have their own sustainability initiatives and benchmarks around greenhouse gas reduction, energy conservation, raw material preservation, reduced hazard options. And then there's also a lot of activity and pressure in the customer-consumer space to really demand more information about the products that are being on the shelves and that they're purchasing, and to understand how they can tell the difference between products that may be greener. And so we're starting to see more initiatives outside of the regulatory arena with chemical ban lists and then eco-certifications as a means to help consumers differentiate those more favorable products for human health and the environment. So with marketplace trends, it's very clear that the trends are in green chemistry, and as I mentioned, there's a huge push for disclosure and assessment of all ingredients in products and a focus on hazard reduction, which poses some huge challenges as we go forward. And there's the idea today that if we have low hazard, that equals a safer alternative, and that in turn equals a greener product. So we're seeing a selection of green and deselection of hazard classified products. Safer options, as I said, are now being identified outside of the regulatory framework, and eco-labels are one way to gauge that. And as you look across eco-label programs, there are almost probably now more than 300 separate programs out there. And then, as I said, there are many initiatives for voluntary substitution, alternative assessment programs, and other options that are part of corporate sustainability programs and programs with customers and suppliers. So recognizing that landscape, in 2011, HESI formed what was called the Sustainable Alternative Committee, and it was really an emerging issues committee in 2011. It was the very first sustainability project that HESI had identified, and the mission of the committee was to evaluate and identify key elements or criteria and tools that help trigger and guide those assessments while trying to minimize the likelihood of regrettable substitutions. And the main objective was really to develop practical problem-driven guidance on the conduct of alternative assessments. And we held a workshop in February of 2013 at NIHS in North Carolina. And then earlier this year, the committee was actually elevated to a technical committee by the HESI Board of Trustees. This gives you a list of the participants for 2014 on the committee. And so you can see that there's a wide range of industry, government, and academia representation. And the early project objectives for this subcommittee was really just to build an understanding of the existing approaches that were used to select safer, sustainable alternatives. There was a lot of good work out there already. We need to leverage what's out there and not reinvent the wheel. So we took some time to really look through these frameworks that were out there, looking with an eye towards strengths, weaknesses, and gaps in current approaches, and then try to identify what emerging needs or challenges would be for the future, and then to develop and publish those recommendations from the subcommittee. And we focused on 3 areas. First was looking at attributes and tools, and it was clear when we looked through many of the frameworks for alternative assessments that they did look at attributes beyond just hazard. Many of them included life cycle assessment, exposure, risk, performance, cost, social responsibility, those other attributes. And we also looked at new tools for prioritization and assessment of hazard and risk and other attributes. So in other words, what tools were available out there for hazard? Which tools could be available to help us better assess life cycle-like elements? And so just trying to understand what was available to use today. And then another area that we focused on was decision-making and weighing. And how do you make decisions with limited data or minimum data? And what are those best practices for weighing those disparate attributes? And then the third area was looking at data gaps, because oftentimes when we're comparing and looking at alternatives, an alternative may not have all of the same information or may not have all of the information that the chemical of concern that we're looking at might have. So what are data gaps? What are the data needs? And what are some of the solutions for missing data? So you can see that that was quite a large chunk of work that the subcommittee took on all at once as it started. Some of the key accomplishments that I'll highlight is that we now have 2 manuscripts in preparation. We have one that's an overview of the evaluation of the existing frameworks and what we see as future needs and some of the challenges, and then a second manuscript that's talking about a platform for how we might think about decision-making, weighing, and optimizing choices. And then throughout the last couple of years, we have had numerous had outreach to numerous conferences, including the Society of Toxicology, the Green Chemistry and Engineering Conference, and then American Chemical Society and the Society for Environmental Toxicology, CTAC. This is just a chart that gives you an idea of the frameworks that the HESI subcommittee had looked at in some detail, and looking at the attributes that were included in the frameworks that we evaluated. And again, you can see that many of the alternative assessment frameworks include additional attributes in addition to the hazard component. And then this slide is a slide of some of the key tools that we looked at. So the green chemical screening tools. And as you can see, there aren't very many tools that are available for the other areas. We have lots of tools that we can look at hazard, but not very many tools that can be used to give us information on the other attributes that an alternative assessment is often suggesting that we should be gathering information on. So some of the challenges that really came out of our assessment is that it was clear that there wasn't really a standard metric that was across programs to determine greenness. It really depended on the program that you were looking at and where they put emphasis on throughout that assessment. And that most programs focus primarily on hazard classification of individual components, not surprising because that's where the majority of the tools exist today. And that other important sustainability criteria are often difficult to incorporate. So when we start to want to look at things like energy or water efficiency or use of renewable feedstock, that information is much harder to get and to incorporate into assessments. Also, assessments can vary by tool and assessor, and this could lead in some cases to different or conflicting results depending on if a same chemical was assessed by different tools, or if we have a very sophisticated person using the tool and doing the assessment compared to a person that may not have as much technical background. And this is another challenge because tools are often used by a variety of different stakeholders along the value chain who may have more or less technical expertise. And then the question about whether or not we have the right criteria in all cases, and is that criteria adequate to really discriminate between material profiles to help us guide the best choices. And I think of this as a scientist when I'm doing, working with an assay to measure maybe some biological activity. It has to be able to discriminate between different levels of biological activity to provide some useful output. So thinking about the tools that we're using for making decisions and choices about lower hazard, are they really giving us the right or always the best information? So just questions to think about. So where did we land? We landed with trying to really start with the vision as a subcommittee, which is that we have information to make and guide sustainable choices. And clearly, as we got through the process, it was obvious that that is not the case, that we have a long way to go before we really have the information and the tools that are going to get us to that point and that vision. And that really where we're at today is at the hazard-based step in the process, I guess we could say. Now, subsequent to the work that we've done, just very recently, the National Academy of Sciences report on a framework to guide selection of chemical alternatives came out. And this is a fairly detailed guide on the report out of NAS. And their charge was really to limit their assessment to safer chemical substitutes as determined by human health and ecological risks. So they were very careful about framing that, they weren't doing what they would call a sustainability assessment, which would include all of those other components that we talked about, but that in terms of what their charge was, an alternative assessment really meant looking at the human health and ecological risks. And this is a very good report. I think if you haven't had a chance to look at it or peruse it, I would encourage you to do so. We've given you a list to where you can, a link to where you can find it. And I think on the next slide we even have the link directly to where you can download a copy of the report. But what they do is they start to now present some standard lists of endpoints. Now, are these the only endpoints? No, but they're starting to present a starting point and a guide of some standard endpoints that could be used. And then if you look at their safety assessment components within the report, what they're suggesting is they're elevating now the role of physical chemical properties, because in many cases we can discern certain things about the human health or ecological profile just by looking at the phys chem properties. And so there's some greater emphasis now that's placed on looking at those attributes first and comparing alternatives, and then from there moving into the human health hazards as a separate evaluation, ecotoxicity as a separate evaluation, and then looking at a comparative exposure assessment. And what they mean by comparative exposure is that we need to understand the exposure pattern of the new chemical, make sure that it's not different, so it can help us identify the relevance of certain hazards that we're looking at as part of the hazard assessment. So I think this is a really nice way to look at this and breaking this down, and you'll see why I think this is important as we go forward into the presentation. But then they also include element of life cycle thinking, and this is looking at risks beyond the point of use of the application. So not just looking at the end-use application, but thinking more life cycle about the life cycle of that chemical, where it's used and where we might see other potential challenges along the human health and risk side. And then as part of it, even though it wasn't part of the charge, they looked at optional components that could be done. So life cycle assessments, performance, and economics were components that were in the framework that were considered optional, but they were giving guidance on how one might look at and go about this. So their whole goal was really to develop something that could be flexible, but could provide enough guidance to guide someone through the process. Let me get to the next slide. Sorry. So if we look at the frameworks, because NAS did exactly what HESI did, they went back and said, well, let's go see what's already been done. Let's see what they're calling for. So they reviewed the same frameworks that we reviewed as a HESI subcommittee, but then they expanded beyond to look at what REACH was requesting from an authorization standpoint and what UNEP and TURI were requesting. And UNEP is just the Persistent Organic Pollutants Review Committee General Guidance on Alternatives. And TURI is the Alternative Assessment Process Guidance that was developed by the University of Massachusetts at Lowell. So they also looked at a couple of tools, Green Screen and then UCLA multi-criteria decision analysis as part of the framework and did use these in the case studies that they report. And then another really important element, I think, is that they really call out and highlight the importance of using novel data streams. And so anybody who's in the toxicology arena right now, I think, can appreciate just how rapid the science is evolving and how quickly we're starting to move to data streams that are more in silico, cheminformatics, biological profiling, very high throughput type of data. So how do we start to use those novel data streams, and especially how do we use them if we don't have a good alternative and we have to, consider research or de novo design. So I pull this out, the statement, future efforts are needed to guide needed to develop principles or tools that support the benchmarking and integration of high throughput data on chemical effects, because that's really where we're headed. I think we're going to start to see an overwhelming amount of new data and new data streams, and we need to understand those and understand how we can apply those to help us guide those decisions about better alternatives. So the next slide, seems to be, the next slide is going to just show you the flow chart for NAS process, and that's not advancing. There we go. And again, you'll see this in their report, but really what they have is they have a problem definition where you've identified a chemical of concern. You're going to scope out that problem and then determine if there are any potential alternatives. If there are, that puts you into this alternative assessment process where we begin with physical chemical properties and then the other three areas for assessment: human health, the comparative exposure assessment, and ecotoxicity. And then if you have alternatives, then you come down now and you start to look at the life cycle thinking element, and then if needed and if you want to perform these optional assessments, those are included till you ultimately get to selecting the alternative. And you'll see that in here they have a loop that really takes us back to research and de novo design and bringing those new products back into the assessment process, which I think really emphasizes where the need for new emerging data is going to become critical. I also want to just highlight a small project that was done by the American Chemistry Council Value Chain Outreach Committee, and this is their tools subcommittee because they're also, as an industry, looking at tools and how can we improve the tools so that they can be used more effectively across the value chain. And so they did a very small pilot looking at 7 chemicals, a couple of natural materials, and some industrial chemicals, and looking at the output that we would get by doing assessments across some key influential tools that are in use today. And I guess what I want to do is just highlight a few things. One is that depending on the tool, the tool itself seems to be having a little bit of trouble if we're condensing down to one value, a preferable option. So within the tool, it seems like when we're condensing down to a single output for the whole assessment, we're not getting the ability to really discriminate differences in toxicity profiles, and we can talk more about why that is in a minute. But you can see here we're getting a little bit better discrimination, but again, probably it would be nice if we could see more if we look at the green screen assessment. But the more, I think, and bigger opportunity is that if we look across tools, we can get everything from unacceptable to favorable. So it really depends on the tool that you're using, the outputs you're going to get. And I think that's the bigger opportunity, is that if all of these tools are designed to be used to help us identify what we think is a lower hazard, safer alternative, we would hope that we would get the same output there. Now, there's a number of reasons why this could be, and as we look at the tools in more detail and how the tools are driving decisions, clearly there are differences in endpoints across the tools. So some tools have, maybe more endpoints or very different endpoints compared to another tool, so they can differ in the type and in the absolute number, and this can certainly contribute to some of the variation that we see in the output. The other thing is information sources. Different tools draw information from different places, and again, the information that's contributing to the output, because it can be different and vary, can lead to different outputs from different tools. And then weighting preferences can be different. How we weight certain endpoints within the assessment can impact how the output of that tool is. I think if we look at some of the output within a tool, when we collapse things into a single number or a single assessment outcome, sometimes we lose the ability to discriminate, and so it really takes a technical eye to go in there and look at it. And so if you think about the chemicals that were part of that pilot project, some of them had unfavorable human health profiles, some of them had unfavorable environmental profiles, but when it all gets collapsed, they look the same, and they're really not. So how can we improve, the way that we're using that information to make it easier to see these differences for maybe a person that's not as technically trained, and really make those tools more effective for a non-professional, I would just say, type of user. And certainly they have different methods of handling data gaps, and that's another, I think, area of variation when we're looking at the output across tools. And then, of course, value judgments. There's always some value judgments that have to be made when we're doing these types of assessments. Get to the next slide. So what does this mean for the subcommittee? I think it really identifies some real opportunities for this particular technical committee, because looking at the work from ACC and what the National Academy of Sciences Alternative Assessments Framework recommendations are, we, I think, as a technical community, have a real opportunity to say, how do we, improve the existing tools so that they can deliver better and enhanced information for guiding those decisions that we want to make about materials that have lower impact to human health and the environment. So can we identify and demonstrate, what type of safety information should be used for these tools? Get a little bit more consistency, maybe develop a framework, look at some of the tools that are really being used, and see how they're structuring their information, and try to get some guidance similar to what NAS did, putting together, a list to start from, so that tools will always, at least always, incorporate some minimum base data set. And then can we build consensus on approaches to reduce sources of variation? So maybe identifying what we would consider to be more reliable and relevant sources of information, or some hierarchy of quality. As you go through the NAS report, they've attempted to do this with several different methods for looking at certainty of the data with which it was being used to make that decision. So other opportunities to build on what NAS has recommended already in their report. And then really, build out the case studies so that we can demonstrate that what we're recommending really works and really is fit for purpose. I think this is important as we go forward. And then more importantly, how do we enhance it so we can incorporate the advances in science? There's so much work going on right now, as I said, in the field of toxicology. So is there an opportunity to develop principles or tools to support that integration of the next generation safety data so that we can make it more relevant and more meaningful as we look at our assessments? And then also, as part of the evolution in the science, we are developing the capability now to be able to estimate exposures more readily. And how do we leverage that information, and can we use that information as part of the process that NAS has shown with the comparative exposure assessment? And then ultimately, looking to that vision to the future, how do we start to build it out to include other LCA-like attributes based on what we've been able to accomplish and achieve with the enhancements that we make in these other areas. So if you think about it, we've started out really big as a subcommittee, and we're really looking at now contracting and going to starting simple and building towards the more complex question, because it is a journey. And we have to start somewhere, and we have to take the steps that move us in the right direction, because if we're looking for the perfect answer, we're going to do nothing. So we're taking a step back, and what we want to do now is, we know that we've been working in the safety hazard analysis area because that's where our data exists. That's what our tools are out there are developed for. So how do we build out this, enhance these areas with new emerging data, the new science, and then ultimately, how do we drive to get to the more greater quantitative type of information and life cycle sustainability type of attributes that are really needed as we're looking at sustainable solutions, not just lower hazard or lower risk. So it's really increasing confidence in the chemical product evaluation framework, going from simple to more robust as we start on this journey, and really having that vision of wanting to move into how do we drive sustainable choices. So again, back to the vision, we started out here with the sustainable choices. We're going to come back now to where we're at and work in the world that we have today and try to work on access and use of hazard and exposure and information on other attributes, and moving towards more risk life cycle based approaches. So with that in mind, the work plan that we have for 2015 is really to get a workshop organized in 2015, hopefully first quarter, and bring some of the thought leaders together in this area to help put a plan in place for, what are some of the opportunities to reduce variability in existing tools, because nobody's going to use one tool. There's going to always be multiple tools, and people are going to have choices. So how do we make sure that those tools are going to give consistent output? Can we identify and develop principles to incorporate next-gen safety data, either to help in filling data gaps or just to improve decision-making, because maybe these may become more relevant than the high-dose, animal toxicity studies that we're using today. And then, as I said, as part of that workshop, then really identify some good case studies that we could then use to test and evaluate the recommendations that we're making, and to show that they do work and they do have value in improving this process, and then to publish those. So One thought, and this is just my thought, is looking at, is there a way to leverage the NAS alternative assessment framework as part of that process as we're thinking about how we might approach developing a plan to address these challenges. And then the second phase would be then again building out, developing principles and tools that can continue to push where the science is going, where the new data is, and how we can, continue to promote the integration and use of that kind of information through more tests and case studies. So with that, as I said, we're looking for, real thought leaders in this area. This is a tremendous opportunity, I think, to really leverage all of the good work that's been done to date and to extend that into where the science is going and to make it relevant with today's science. And so we're going to extend the opportunity to anybody who's interested and wants to help us tackle this issue to join the HESI Sustainable Chemical Assessment Technical Committee. There would be no cost to participate this year and to sit in on our subcommittee calls if you want to get a better flavor for where we're going and how this is going to play out. In 2015, the company assessment would be $6,000 to participate on the committee. And there's really, the committee meets almost exclusively via teleconference, so the only travel investment would be as part of being at the workshop and helping to, execute that piece of it. So I'll leave you with this information. If you're interested, if you want more information, you can contact Ms. Brianna Farr, and her contact information is there. But we would really welcome a very much the diversity of thought that I think the participants that signed up for this webinar could bring to the table.